Let's talk about global poverty. Have you ever wondered if it's just an unfortunate accident? A natural state of being that we're slowly chipping away at? Or could it be something else entirely? Could it actually be the result of a system, one that was deliberately designed over centuries to create the exact inequality we see all around us?
Yeah, that's really the core question we're tackling today. Is widespread poverty a bug in the system, or is it a feature? Is it an accident? Or is it the predictable outcome of how the whole thing was built to work in the first place?
Okay, so to really dig into this, we have to get our heads around one key idea: underdevelopment. Now, this isn't what you might think. We're not talking about places that are just lagging behind or not yet developed. No, thinkers like Walter Rodney argued it's an active process. Imagine it like this. One group's prosperity is directly connected to and even causes the poverty of another through the systematic extraction of wealth and labor.
Right, so if this is an active process, something has to be driving it. So what's the engine here? Well, it really comes down to two things: labor and wealth. Let's take a look at Dr. Claude Anderson's work in Black Labor, White Wealth. His argument is, wow, it's powerful. He says the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans wasn't just some part of the American economy. He argues it was the foundational capital, the very seed money that built the nation's wealth. Think about that. It's a single process that did two things at once. It created astronomical wealth for one group, and at the same time, it systematically stopped the people who created that wealth from ever building any of their own.
And this wasn't just happening in America, not by a long shot. As the historian John Henrik Clark explained, this was a global system. The transatlantic slave trade was basically the fuel for European capitalism. The prosperity of Europe was literally built on the backs of Africa, by stripping it of both its people and its resources.
This brings us to a really interesting point, kind of like a paradox. Manning Marble points out that the problem wasn't that black communities were left out of the capitalist system. Oh no, they were very much in it. The problem was how they were integrated as a permanent, built-in source of cheap, exploitable labor. So their very inclusion in the system was the tool used to underdevelop them.
So a system like this doesn't just keep going for hundreds of years by accident, right? It has to be baked into the system. It gets written into the rules, the laws, the very institutions that run a society.
The book Why Nations Fail gives us a really useful way to think about this. It basically says there are two kinds of institutions. You've got inclusive ones, think secure property rights, fair laws, public services, the stuff that creates a level playing field for everyone. And then you've got extractive institutions. Their whole purpose is to do the opposite, to take wealth from the majority and funnel it up to a small, powerful elite.
And here's the kicker. These two things feed each other. You have extractive political institutions, where a small group holds all the power, and what do? They create extractive economic institutions that make them rich. And that new wealth, it just helps them tighten their grip on political power. It's a vicious cycle that just reinforces itself over and over again.
Let's look at a real-world example. You see this map? It shows powerful, organized African kingdoms like the Congo. Well, when colonial powers showed up, they basically just ignored all of that. They drew new lines on the map and set up their own systems. And these new systems weren't designed to help the people living there. Nope, they were designed for one thing: to get resources out of Africa and back to Europe as efficiently as possible.
And it wasn't just about borders and governments. Walter Rodney pointed out that this way of thinking went all the way down to education. The goal of colonial education wasn't really to empower people. It was to train just enough of the local population to fill the bottom-rung jobs in the colonial machine. Basic clerks, low-level administrators. This just made them even more dependent on the colonial power.
Okay, so you build these systems over centuries. What happens next? What are the long-term consequences? Well, this is where the conversation gets really heated, especially when you start talking about culture and foreign aid today.
Back in 1965, there was this hugely influential paper called the Moynihan Report. It claimed that the root of ongoing poverty in black communities was a tangle of pathology, specifically the breakdown of the family structure. Now, what this did was it basically put the blame for poverty on the culture of the community itself.
But a lot of other scholars looked at that and said, whoa, hold on, you've got this completely backwards. Their argument is that these social issues aren't the cause of poverty, they're the result of it. The logical, predictable outcome of centuries of having wealth stolen and being denied opportunities. It's a classic case of confusing the symptom with the disease. And believe it or not, this same debate about cause and effect is still raging today, especially around foreign aid. Take the economist Dambisa Moyo. In her book Dead Aid,
She makes this provocative argument that huge, long-term aid programs have, ironically, become a new kind of problem. She says they can create dependency, help keep corrupt leaders in power, and actually crush local businesses, trapping countries in poverty instead of helping them.
And Moyo points to some pretty startling data to back this up. If you look at the period when aid to Africa was at its absolute highest, what happened to the poverty rate? It didn't go down. It went way up, from 11% to 66%. For her, that's a huge red flag that the whole model of aid might be a broken institution itself, maybe even one that's doing more harm than good.
All right, we've talked about labor, we've talked about institutions, and we've talked about the consequences. So, where do we go from here? It seems like all of this points to one thing. We might need to totally change the way we even think about poverty and wealth.
Here's the big reframing. What if wealth and poverty aren't two different things? What if they're actually two sides of the same coin? The argument we've been exploring suggests that they are, that the immense wealth in some parts of the world isn't separate from the deep poverty in others. It's structurally and historically connected to it.
So let's just run through the whole cycle one more time. It starts with step 1, extraction of labor and resources. That's what concentrates the wealth. Step 2, that system gets locked in place by official rules and institutions. Step 3, this creates the long-term results, systemic poverty and dependency. And finally, step 4, the cycle just keeps going because the whole system is built to keep itself running. It's a tough cycle to break.
Which leads us with one last, really challenging question to think about. If poverty isn't just a lack of stuff, if it's not an accident but the actual intended result of how our global institutions are designed, then what does that mean for how we try to fix it? What kind of solutions do you even begin to think about when you're trying to change the blueprint of the entire system?